Good morning. I'm Natalie Emheiser from ITC Midwest. For the 6th year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As the electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is committed to the future of Iowa. As a native Iowan who is a working professional in my home state, I'm keenly interested in helping to improve our state for our long-term quality of life. At ITC Midwest, we often talk about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There is also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your minds to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place, now and for generations to come. Thank you for your participation to help shape the future of our great state. Have a great conference.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 Iowa Ideas Conference. My name is Zach Kaczarski, and I'm the executive editor at the Gazette. On behalf of the entire team, we appreciate you taking time to join us over the next day and a half. Since 2016, Iowa Ideas has connected people from across the state to address issues, hear perspectives, and explore solutions. Last year, Iowa Ideas collectively engaged more than 2,000 people, and we're primed to exceed that number this year, and we're very excited about that. Before we dive into our first session, I want to take a moment to thank the advisory councils that have helped us shape the sessions that you'll experience. These are folks from across the state with deep knowledge on things from healthcare, energy and environment, education, and beyond. Many are attendees, and in some cases, they're serving in moderator capacity over the next day and a half. Another group that makes this conference possible is our sponsors. To continue free registration and access for anyone who wishes to participate, our sponsors provide the necessary resources to build this conference experience for anyone who wants to join the conversation. A big thanks to our presenting sponsor, who has been with us from the start, ITC Midwest, and thanks to our track sponsors, UFG Insurance, Inclusive ICR, Tanager, and Mid-American Energy. Next, thank you to Kirkwood Community College for being our 2024 keynote sponsor, giving us runway to work with a variety of voices and perspectives. Now, a word from Kirkwood President Christy Fisher.
Hello, I'm Christy Fisher, President of Kirkwood Community College. We're proud to once again partner with the Iowa Ideas Conference. I hope you walk away with several new ideas and valuable partnerships. The same kind of partnerships Kirkwood has with regional employers, industry leaders, and communities, where we help build a workforce pipeline that strengthens our economy and prepares Iowans for the future. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks to Kirkwood. This morning, we kick off the 2024 Iowa Ideas Conference by bringing you one of the Gazette's newest weekly features, Curious Iowa. Curious Iowa launched in May 2023 and had the premise of empowering readers to submit questions and discover answers about Iowa, the region, and its people. Readers have submitted a variety of questions, from how did streets get named to what happens to recycled plastic bags, and a heck of a lot more. And now, leading our first live edition of Curious Iowa, to answer the question, what is Iowa's environmental history? Please welcome Gazette journalist Bailey Chihan.
Thanks, Zach. The past influences the moment we are in. The sessions you will attend throughout this conference focus on current issues facing Iowans. But this session will provide context into why Iowa looks the way it does today. We have limited time together, and we hope to cover moments in history from the 1840s to today. Buckle up for the ride. You will hear from the following people. Kevin Mason is a rural and environmental historian of the American Midwest. He is an associate professor of history at Waldorf University in Forest City, and he's also the founder of the digital humanities project Notes on Iowa and the author of a forthcoming book about Iowa's identity and environmental history. Christine Nemec manages the Iowa Roadside Management Program at the University of Northern Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Center, which supports and raises awareness of Iowa's county roadside vegetation programs. Christine has previously worked as a restoration ecologist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Nebraska and as a research entomologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in South Dakota. Leo Landis is the state curator for the State Historical Society of Iowa in Des Moines. Leo has served as an Iowa history content expert for humanities projects and print and broadcast media across the state. To start our conversation, I want to paint you all a picture. Dr. Tom Rosberg, a prairie expert from Drake University, told me that Iowa's landscape looked like a mosaic of ecosystems prior to European settlers arriving on the land that makes up our state today. This included prairie, savanna, forests, woodlands, and wetlands. The native landscape acted as a sponge, he said. These ecosystems supported diverse wildlife, and the state had a lot less trees back then because the regular use of fire kept grasslands healthy and effectively weeded out the trees. Kevin, obviously things changed drastically when settlers began pouring into the land. Can you describe some of those changes in the 1840s and 1850s?
So pouring in is I think, good way to think about it. The population growth we're going to see as we're seeing displacement of the Ocheti, Shakowin, Dakota, the Iowa, Bahoche, the Meskwaki, and Sauk as they're being pushed westward across and ultimately out of the state across treaties in the 1830s and 1840s, we're going to see new populations pouring into Iowa. The official population in the 1840 census, only 43,112 people. By 1860 alone, that number is going to jump to well over a million. We're at 1,194,000 by 1860. And that's just counting that official United States recorded population. Those people are going to come in and radically reshape the environment. The argument can easily be made, it's been made by Connie Muddle as well as others, that Iowa's changed maybe more than anywhere on Earth. 98% of our land surface is going to be converted over the course of the 1800s, the early 1900s. And that obviously takes place in the ways we think about it, conversion to cropland, but also ways that are maybe more subtle. Things like we dropped the water table in the state on average about 4 feet. We straightened nearly 4,000 miles of streams and rivers across Iowa. And we changed things radically. And in the 1800s specifically, we can see as that land survey is getting underway, one of the stats that's really telling between 1840 and 1860 is we're just moving, in the decade between 1850 and 1860, moving from only about 800,000 acres of improved land to almost 3.8 million acres of improved land just in the decade of the 1850s alone. And as that changes, people are coming in largely for creating agricultural farmsteads. So they're changing the land. You look at in that 1850-1860 window, we're going from 4,800 farms in the state to almost 62,000 farms by the time we get to 1860. And with that, we're starting to see the rise of commodity crops and other things we'll talk about, where like in 1850, we're 19th in the country, and there's not 50 states yet in 1850, right? In corn production, we've climbed all the way to 7th by 1860. And we're seeing diverse agriculture during this time period. Most people are growing corn, wheat, oats. They're also haying. We're seeing those in 4 crop rotations. Some people are growing potatoes as well. And they're also bringing in livestock in incredible numbers. Again, in that 1850 to 1860 window, just like the number of horses on farms, you go from 38,000 horses to over 175,000 horses on farms by 1860. We're also seeing, Leo could talk better to oxen than me. I know he's always talking about driving them for some of his past experiences. But like in 1850, we have about 20,000 oxen on farms. That number is going to be 60,000 by 1860. And we can see those across others. And as they come in, a lot of times we talk about that displacement of ecosystem and habitat. We're seeing that impact upon our indigenous peoples, incredibly, ways of life that have developed over thousands of years being completely disrupted. We're also seeing that in terms of wildlife. Across the 1800s, we're going to see over 68 species of mammals in Iowa. 10 of those are going to be extirpated or extinct within the bounds by the close of the 1800s. We're also going to see extirpation of at least a dozen different types of birds, different types of fish, and we're going to see many of them dwindle to numbers that would put them in endangered status if that status existed during the 1800s, as many as 38 different species across different types. So we're talking about a really significant change as we transition kind of away from that tall grass prairie, oak savanna, and then the wetlands that I think are really easy to take for granted, especially on the Des Moines Lobe, where I live. Completely changes the ecosystem. Looks incredibly different if you look at those early documents that come from things like Kearney's 1820 Dragoons expedition or the 1835 March of the Dragoons up the Des Moines River. Some of those types of records, trying to see those against what the landscape looks like today, you can really, it's hard to wrap your mind around the incredible change that's taken place in Iowa.
Sure. I'm going to go back a little bit. You were talking about land surveys, and according to the original public land survey of Iowa in the 1850s, the state had 23.3 million acres of prairie, and today just 0.1% of that remains. Christine, I'm wondering, why are prairie plants so important to Iowa's landscape?
Well, if you look at tallgrass prairie, you'll see there are 4 to 6 feet tall grasses. You'll see lots of different kinds of flowers. You can see the habitat value. But what you don't see is what's below the surface. And that's where some of the greatest value of tallgrass prairie, not just the above ground habitat, but below ground, tallgrass prairie plant roots can be up to 6 to 8 feet deep. They're tremendously dense and spongy. They hold the soil in place. They help reduce erosion. A lot of the benefit of those really deep, dense roots is water quality. The roots are great at adhering to nutrients, absorbing nutrients, reducing pollution. So that's a benefit we get, is the improved water quality. In addition to the habitat, I know there's a lot of concern about bees and butterflies. The Fish and Wildlife Service will be deciding if the monarch butterfly should be endangered. That decision will be made by December. And a lot of that is loss of habitat. We don't have enough prairie maybe to support large herds of bison like we used to. But even smaller pieces of prairie can at least help pollinators. And a little bit larger pieces of prairie can help those declining grassland birds.
Leo, is there anything you want to add on what we just talked about?
I'll just comment as we talk about landscape, and Kevin and Christine have addressed it really well. But when Albert Lee is exploring Iowa in the 1830s, he talks about the state being one grand rolling prairie. But Kevin did a nice job of talking about the diversity, and as did Christine, of the diversity of the ecosystems, and that Des Moines Lobe that Kevin was talking about. As people were coming through in the 1850s, Charles Aldrich, who actually was one of my predecessors as a curator at the historical department, talks about the term is slough. It's spelled S-L-O-U-G-H, but prairie sloughs around Webster and Hamilton County just would bog down people. The wetlands were so rich and diverse there. So we think about prairies, but as Kevin and Christine have mentioned, a lot of different ecosystems in our state.
So we talked about how agriculture really dominated our state in the early days. And, that's kind of the connotation that people have with Iowa today. I'm interested in how the family farm has changed over the past 150 years. Kevin, do you want to talk a little bit about that transition?
Sure. We've seen all sorts of changes in agriculture, especially over the 20th century. And a lot of that has to do with outside market forces, has to do with changes in technologies. You think about, even if we just take corn, for example, you think about some of the innovations made in Iowa by folks like Henry Wallace, and you talk about the finding, or Garst, and hybrid seed and the development in Des Moines and the rise of agribusiness and some of those things. You think about in the post-World War II era, we're going to see all sorts of changes in technologies, whether that's in chemical applications, nutrients, other kind of things like that. And then over the longer arc of time, we see all sorts of equipment changes, right? I was on my way here to Waldorf this morning, and it's at that time of year, at least here in North Iowa, where we're seeing like heavy ag traffic. I thought I was maybe going to be late, where you're going past and looking at some of the tractors now, and you're talking about $1 million machines that are really complex pieces of equipment. And as all of those changes happen, they're going to radically change the business of agriculture, where we're going to see production in terms of billions of bushels rise from about 2.5 million in 1920 to where peaking over 15 million in the early 2010s. We're also going to see those price fluctuations of some of that stuff, whether that's related to federal policy in the farm bills or the kind of ever neutral granary, or now some of our commodity support programs. But the broader point is we're also going to see that change who farms. I think one of the common misconception stereotypes in Iowa, although we have lots of folks that work in agribusiness, our on-farm population of producers continues to decline over the course of the 21st century. And that's a trend that moves after Iowa shifts from being more rural to technically urban, according to the census in the middle of the 20th century. We're also seeing other changes in terms of what farmers plant and in what quantities and for what reasons. So we can see these changes, whether that's one of the things I was thinking about is we have kind of a X, if you want to visualize the chart, thinking about like in 1970 even, so a fairly recent moment before we get into the farm crisis, we're seeing smaller numbers of hogs per farm. We're still under 200. By the time we even get to the new millennium, to the end of the 1990s, we're looking at almost 1,000 hogs per operation. And at the same time, the other axis on that graph is falling radically, where there's a long history of hogs in Iowa, which I think Leo will maybe talk to us about, where like in 1970, we see like 90,000 farms in Iowa raising hogs. That's falling below 20,000 by the time we get to the year 2000. And that number's continued to decline, where that kind of, if we want to think about it as that X, has continued to concentrate the number of hogs in specific places and counties. As well as we've seen the number of people actually farming those hogs decline to a point where our farm producers are now representing somewhere between 3 and 5% of our population. If we look in that 1840s and some of that population data before, that's the overwhelming majority of folks that are coming here during that initial wave of settlement.
We'll get back to corn and hogs a little bit later, but for the sake of time, we're going to jump kind of backwards to the 1970s. Do you have whiplash? I do. Christine, can you talk about the Living Roadway Trust Fund and roadside management programs when they were created? Because I think that kind of leads us into a conversation of efforts today.
Sure. I think the decades leading up to the creation of the Living Roadway Trust Fund are important. In the 1960s, at a national level, Lady Bird Johnson started to talk about beautifying roadsides with wildflowers. In the 70s, the Iowa DOT started talking about how can we save money on fuel, on mowing, because that's, of course, when the fuel crisis was. In the 80s, Iowans became more and more concerned about groundwater quality. At that time, it was more standard for the DOT or road departments at the county level to blanket spray herbicides if they wanted to control weeds. So if there's a weed problem, well, let's just spray everything. But that doesn't really control the problem in the long run because it creates more bare soil, more weeds come in. It wasn't that sustainable. And the public was concerned about, why are we spraying all these herbicides in the roadsides? It's just going to affect water quality. So because of all those factors, there was more and more interest in planting native plants along the roadsides. In the late 80s, the Iowa DOT or the Iowa legislature passed legislation creating the Living Roadway Trust Fund and creating positions to implement that fund and to support counties and cities across the state that wanted to manage their roadsides in a more sustainable, cost-effective, strategic manner. So instead of just blanket spraying everything, prioritizing, what are the noxious weeds we really need to control? Do we really need to mow everything? Of course, you want to mow closest to the road. Safety is priority number one when managing roadside vegetation. You have to have sight lines. But once you get further away the road, it's not as critical to mow as long as there's no visibility concerns, safety concerns. There's some of the roadsides that don't have to be mowed. So the Living Roadway Trust Fund is basically a source of money, support for counties and cities that want to maybe use strategic mowing, strategic herbicide use, planting natives to get those benefits of reduced erosion, pollinator habitat, beautifying the roadside. So that's why Iowa has the Living Roadway Trust Fund, which, as far as I know, is the only consistent source of funding in the country to practice an ecological manner of roadside management along county and city roadsides. There's some other DOTs that do this along state, but it's unusual to do it at such a local level, such a widespread area across the state.
And for those of you who are interested in learning more about native plants and prairie restoration and things like that, the Gazette's done some recent reporting. I've personally done the reporting on that, so take a look at the Gazette's website for that. Leo, do you want to talk a little bit about prairie strips and their use in ag today?
There's been some really great work done at Iowa State on just how even small strips of prairie can help benefit water quality and biodiversity along traditional agricultural farm fields. So some really great work happening in Southwest Iowa, but across the state. And when you think about we may get to corn and hogs again a little bit later, so I may hold off on at least one comment on native crop or native plants, but corn is a native crop to Iowa. So that's something to keep in mind about ecosystems of Iowa, at least introduced by humans and cultivated. But thinking about how things are coming around again, just the idea that, farms across the state trying to keep the environment and being promoted by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Iowa State and other organizations to make sure that we're looking at past traditions of keeping either fence rows or roadside private property in maybe some prairie that hadn't been thought of in the past. So some really great work happening. Nice New York Times article that ran last week that if anybody paying attention, we could share out as a shared link.
Yeah, let's come back to corn. We keep talking about corn and hogs. So according to Iowa State University, Iowa ranks first in the nation for corn production and has the largest hog inventory and the second most hog operations in the United States. Kevin, can you talk about Iowa's long tradition of corn agriculture?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, as Leo noted, corn has a long history in Iowa after originating in South and Central America. We're going to see corn have significance for all of the state's indigenous peoples in the pre-contact, pre-colonial era, where whether it's the Saukamisquai are very agricultural people, the Iowa Bahoche are very agricultural as well. But even tribes or indigenous nations we talk about as being less agricultural, like the Dakota, credit their origination site of corn agriculture is within the bounds of the state of Iowa and Northwest Iowa. And we can see that history developing over time. As corn takes off, it's going to become very profitable early, especially when paired with hogs. One of the things is we keep talking about them together, but that's also how people on early farms thought about them. It was early farmers in Iowa, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but you could, I know that there's a quote in Joe Anderson's great book about the broader hog industry that talks about hogs are just bushels on the hoof. You can feed corn to them. You can make different products. And you can also, the corn that's being grown in early Iowa is easier subsumed by humans. And you're able to provide for your family, provide for an external commodity market, and then also feed your livestock in a fairly meaningful way. As we get through kind of the close of the 19th century, move into the 20th century, the technologies around corn are going to just really start to radically change. Part of that's there's an Iowa State professor of agronomy, first head of the Iowa State University Extension, PG Holden, who's going to really cut his teeth doing what are called corn shows. People really got caught into what corn looked like as being the marker of good genetics. And that's going to lead really into inspiring people like a young Henry Wallace to start experimenting with corn in all sorts of ways. Wallace notoriously, when he was a student at Iowa State, ate nothing but corn for a 6-week period at one point in time to see its effects on the body. That didn't inspire him to take that up long term, but it did get him experimenting with different genetic typologies, which eventually led to the rise of the hybrid kind of corn movement in America, and Pioneer at the forefront of that, as well as people like Roswell Garst, who's going to be one of his early partners on Pioneer. Corn then continues to radically change as plant genetic science moves forward over the course of the 20th century to the point where we're seeing all sorts of different kind of don't know, genetic introductions into the science that are going to change both who owns those genetic patterns, how farmers access them, and then also seeks to solve other issues common to farmers other than just yields and some of those other commodity things. But I think maybe, I don't know, you could get way too deep into seed genetics. It's a fun thing, but I don't know that that's great for our conversation today.
Sure. Leo, we kind of talked about early crop rotations. When does corn kind of become a focus for our state, and what were early European settlers growing?
So corn really is the one crop that Iowa farmers from, as Kevin has related, going back to tribal nations, been a staple, and as a essentially crop that comes out of Central America, as Kevin referenced, is the crop for Iowa farmers to raise hogs. And besides corn, there's wheat and oats and potatoes. Kevin mentioned those. Can give you the thumbnail kind of genetics that really matters for folks paying attention this morning. Is there's a number of types of corn in general, but the two types that create hybrid corn are what's called a flint corn, which is the northern New England. The seed is a rounded top seed, and then there's a dent corn. And so that cross between flints and dent corn is, and in Iowa, we're, a great environment for raising corn, but that's what then becomes the basis of hybrid corns, or the corn that's raised in the Midwest. So Reed's yellow dent is developed out of Illinois. It becomes a popular corn in the early 1900s. So corn is always dominant in Iowa farmsteads, but through the 1890s, early 1900s, wheat is the direct cash crop for Iowa farmers. So the elevators that are popping up, and as Kevin referenced, farm families hauling either soybeans or corn to the elevator today. Well, 120 years ago, what was being hauled to the elevator often was going to be wheat in Iowa, Sioux City, over to the eastern part of the state. So the elevators that are being developed in our state around the Civil War are being developed for wheat primarily. So that's one of those things we may talk about a little bit later on. The way we farm today is different than the way we farmed 140 years ago, and doesn't always stay the same, because soybeans are a relatively new crop in our state, did not become a major crop until the 1930s, 1940s especially, and post-World War II, even after that. The other thing, as I talk about corn, or we talk about the crops that are being raised, you could even say, and Kevin referenced a great historian named Joseph Anderson. Joe's book on hogs is called Capitalist Pigs, so that's one you can check out. The other one is Industrializing the Corn Belt, and another good look, especially at Iowa farming in that post-World War II and slightly before period. But Iowa farmers raising corn while being done on a larger scale was not a lot different than how Native peoples planted corn, or at least the look of the field. Iowa cornfields up until about 1945 were being planted in hills, and with a distance between 36 to 40 inches between hills. So that way, pre-herbicide, you could go with a horse-drawn cultivator that would dig out the weeds. So mechanical weed removal required a cornfield that was done in hills, essentially, much like Native people did. So that's one thing that we think about how agriculture has changed, and even in the last 80 years, it hasn't been that much different than what it had looked like, other than on a larger scale, as we said, converting prairie into cornfields primarily. And Kevin made a point early on too that I don't want to get away from, or don't want our listeners this morning to miss. He talked about improved land, and that was a government term that developed on taking what was native land, essentially native in different ways, and making it cultivated. And that was truly the government term in the census done for agriculture, saying what amount of your land is improved, what's not improved. So if it was in hay that you had planted, like timothy, which is a grass, or if it was oats or wheat or corn, that was improved land. If it was native prairie, that, or timber, that was unimproved. And so it's part of the cultural ethos that's being built in our nation to say, putting things into corn, wheat, oats, cultivated grasses, later clover, and then alfalfa is improved land. So that term that Kevin used of improved is really kind of the culture saying prairie's not improved. So that's maybe something to think about culturally. But the idea I'll wrap up is to say, corn's always been there since tribal nations have been here, indigenous peoples. It's just the Euro-American farmers find more intense ways to do it, which leads to hog production primarily in Iowa.
Kevin, I want to give you a chance to respond to anything Leo said if you want to. Otherwise, we can move on.
I mean, it is just, yeah, I don't know. I think he summed some things up well and clarified some things. We are seeing like huge, where it's like linking into what Christine's talking about, or we talk about how these methods are changing. Chemicals are a big part of that, where it's like, we're going to see over 10,000 new pesticides introduced in the United States between 1947 and 1952 alone. We're going to see huge amounts of Iowa acreage starting to use herbicide over time, especially on corn acres, where it's like in 1950, only 11% of Iowa's farms are using herbicide. By 1982, at the kind of as the farm crisis really gets going, we're seeing 95% of Iowa's farms using herbicides. And that's, I think, with like the stuff Christine's talking about, where we can see the rise of some of these roadside programs, or we're seeing the I don't know, a new era in public lands, maybe in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Iowa. We're starting to see those things maybe kind of react to some of these other changes we're seeing in agricultural production, is leading to maybe a change in our public lands ethic as well, and the creation of some of the programs like the roadside program, or even like the raising of seed plots, and those being implemented at the county level at places like Lime Creek Nature Center here in North Iowa, and then providing the seed for a lot of that intentional, I don't know, move back towards that.
Before we kind of take our last section of this conversation, I'm going to give you a wild card question here from the audience. Thinking about Iowa's environmental history, you all have depths of knowledge on this. What is your favorite interesting fact, or something that you find really shocking that you want to share with the group?
I feel like I hit my top 4 off the beginning. 98% land change, 4,000 miles of straightened streams and rivers, dropping the water table 4 feet. Those are incredible changes that don't take place other places.
I think globally how endangered tallgrass prairie center is. I think when I was growing up, there's all this talk about the rainforest, but right where I was growing up in the middle of the country, we have one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world, tallgrass prairie. It's just precious. And it's subtle. It's maybe not as grand as mountains or rainforests, but it's extremely valuable. I think that's what was most shocking to me over the course of my career, is realizing how precious tallgrass prairie is and how endangered it is, even on a global, one of the most globally endangered ecosystems right here in the middle of the country.
And Kevin got at this on the intensive changes in hog production, but just to remind folks that even by 1900, we were raising 10 million hogs in Iowa. Today, it's about 20 million and a little bit more. But hog production, as Kevin said, referencing Joe Anderson, hogs on corn on the hoof, bushels on the hoof. Hogs have been critical to Iowa agriculture, and shouldn't be shocked on the numbers today. It's just changed over time.
So we've talked a lot about history, and now we're going to kind of look at the future here. Will our use of the land continue to change? Should we aspire to restore the land to how it was before European settlers arrived? Are we going to see corn and hogs continue to dominate? These are the things we're kind of thinking about. Leo, Kevin, Christine, I'm interested in your responses.
Since you said my name first, I'll go. But you know, the production that drives our economy can certainly be done in sustainable ways, finding balances between those either prairie strips or, it goes back to the 1930s. Kevin referenced Henry A. Wallace. These are ideas that looking at ways to preserve soil and land quality have their roots out of the Soil Conservation Service and even before that. So Iowa farm families have been trying to think of ways for their own economic livelihood to have soil health and water quality addressed and erosion issues addressed. So I think we'll continue to look at ways to, have large scale production in our state in responsible ways. So it would be an economic upheaval to try to transform our state back to a more native looking landscape.
That said, I believe we got the scale we've seen, right? I tend to be fairly cynical. I'm not a forward, I'm a historian, so I'd look backwards a lot. But thinking about some of the just raw data with how we've seen this change over time, there's an upper limit, right, to markets. Some of the things that are creating our current, I don't think the balance can hold with our current dynamic. I mean, we're talking about at any given point in time, 25 million hogs in the state of Iowa, about 35% of the total population in the United States. Around 4 million cattle, which we're fairly stable with. Looking at like over 56 million laying chickens within the state, and 19 of 20 of those are in operations that house more than 100,000 birds, which you see lead to some of the issues with avian diseases and some of that other stuff. Or even just, we talk about land use and following the markets as closely as I do in agriculture. We see some of this, price stability is coming out of the Farm Bill, some of those other things where, in the last calendar year, 60% of our corn crop in Iowa went into ethanol, which we're not here to litigate. I'm sure if you listen to Chris Jones's session later, he'll be railing about that in some way or another. But I think that it's important to recognize that we've seen a continued expansion and emphasis on scale and industrial scale within our agriculture into the 21st century here. And I think it is really important at something like Iowa Ideas to be thinking about a more diverse economic picture in Iowa than simply trying to continue to scale agriculture and extract from the environment in ways that I think we're approaching upper limits of.
Christine, you're an ecologist. I'm really interested in your perspective on, will the use of our land continue to change, or should we bring it back to where it was?
Well, I think in restoration ecology, there's a lot of talk about we'll never be able to replicate exactly what was here. You can't plant the exact same plants. They're not going to thrive. The climate has changed too much. So we're not all about restoring exactly historic ecosystems. When we try to restore ecosystems, we're trying to capture some of those functions that we get from those ecosystems, the habitat, the water quality, the soil health. So I think restoration ecologists, when you hear restoration, they want to make it just like it was, like we're doing a classic car, we're restoring it to how it was. But that ecosystems are too dynamic because of it's about the climate, and we don't have that same climate. So I think it is, like Leo and Kevin alluded to, it's a lot about balance. What's enough? What is enough of our native ecosystems to get those benefits we want while maintaining our working landscapes? I think that's a lot of the thrust of restoration ecology, is getting those functions back while maintaining our economies, finding that balance. And I think there is a balance. It just requires a lot of dialogue and figuring out where the trade-offs are and where can we have these ecosystems. I think that's a conversation for everyone to have.
Absolutely. Kevin, you just finished a book that you've been working on for a couple of years about Iowa's environmental history. And I'm curious what you want Iowans to understand about Iowa's environmental history, but also Iowa's landscape today.
So we're really nice folks, right? That's one of the things I think about a lot in the book and been reflecting on a lot, is that we have this Iowa nice image, right? Where we're very friendly on the surface. And sometimes I think that can lead us to avoid complexities in difficult conversations. And landscape, I think, is one of those for us, where if we need to and truly want to be good stewards of the land, and we want to have, I always joke that Iowans are next year people, derived from our kind of agricultural ethos. If it's dry this year, it'll be wet next year. If it's not a great crop, we'll do better next year. And I think when we pair that kind of next year mindset with kind of this tendency to be at least nice on the surface, we'll let things fester underneath. There are real ecological challenges in the state with our current system. And I think unless we're willing to have those conversations in a constructive way, really take a hard look and work together to find great forward outcomes for everyone, and not just ourselves in this current moment, but being good stewards for our future generations. I think we can unite around that ethic and hopefully create not just a landscape, but an Iowa that can be prosperous and enjoyed well into the future.
Christine, what do you want Iowans to understand about Iowa's landscape?
That we have our landscape is our sense of place. I think that's why native plants are so important. I think non-native plants as well have a lot of cultural value. I have both in my yard. I have certain plants that have cultural value that maybe aren't native to Iowa, but I want a sense of place. I want my yard, my landscape to reflect what Iowa is. And I think that's what makes Iowa, Iowa. People traveling through that's why I like roadside restoration, because it's so visible. And if we can add a little bit of what Iowa used to look like to the roadsides or other parts of the landscape, that helps Iowans appreciate where we're at, as well as the visitors. They get to know who we are.
We received a question from the audience. How will battery electric vehicles affect the market for ethanol and thus corn? And what effect will that have on Iowa land? Maybe Kevin, Leo, Christine, take a second, think about that one.
It's $1 billion question. You talk about, as I kind of referenced, a majority of our current corn crop is likely this year to go into ethanol production, which is supported by the renewable fuel standard, important to communities across the state and the 30 or so ethanol plants that employ people and also create revenue. But you think about some of the different statistical things with ethanol, as it's proven out over time. I always feel like in ethanol, they're still waiting for the big breakthrough. And as the time continues, maybe it hasn't come. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. If I had the answer, I wouldn't be here because I'd be doing other things. But you think about lithium also, I think sometimes we look at it as a panacea, a thing that's going to save the world, and realize that also lithium comes from places. I mean, they just opened a 2-mile deep strip mine in Australia to pull lithium out of that. Now, I'm not an apologist for the ethanol industry, but I think these are all important things to reference as we're going through. I don't know what it means, but without that renewable fuel standard, without ethanol in its current context, it would radically change what agriculture, I think, looks like in the state of Iowa. For whether you're a proponent of that or not, it would create significant change.
And Kevin talked about what historians do. We look back. And so my thought on that, not to totally address how electric vehicles will shape Iowa, but Midwestern farmers, Iowa farm families have found ways to adjust to changes in technology. The reason why we have soybeans and don't have oats anymore is because of that technological revolution of the tractors in the 1920s. Tractors don't eat oats, horses do. And so as we're in an economic depression in the 1930s and Iowa farm families have been transitioning to tractors through the 1920s, I mean, that was a radical transformation of the Midwestern farm, the farms in the United States, transforming from solar-powered horses, essentially, that are eating oats to a fossil fuel tractor, and makes us incredibly more productive, which has trade-offs as well. And so you think about some technology historians talk about, technology is good, bad, or both. I think that about ethanol too. There's advantages and disadvantages, and as Kevin pointed out with lithium, it's not going to be battery powered. Electrified isn't going to be, it has its trade-offs too.
And Leo, too, what do you want Iowans to understand about our environmental history and our landscape today?
Yeah, that's a little bit of what I was trying to get out there, saying if 100 years ago, you would not have seen soybeans on Iowa farms. And today you do. So we have continued to look at markets, look at crops that fit our climate, and find ways to use them. In the 1930s, there was this idea called chemurgy, taking agriculture and industry and marrying them together. And Henry Ford is a big promoter of that idea. And Iowa State University, or Iowa State College then, is deeply involved in finding ways to use farm commodities and adjust to industry. And one of those things that comes out of that is soybean production. So Iowa and a lot of Midwestern states for a short time were making license plates out of a soybean-based composite. In the 1930s, thinking we need new markets, we need new crops. And as soybean oil and other proteins coming out of soybeans were found to have real deep uses, that transformed our landscape too. So things have changed even in the last 80 years on Iowa farms.
Kevin, I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned the water table dropping. Could you just tell us why the water table dropped? Talk a little bit about drain tiling and that sort of thing.
I love drain tile more than most people, I think. No, draining, ditching, and tiling is going to be an incredible landscape force for change. I think maybe I'm more hyper aware of it living where I do, where it really changed this part of the state. And Mason City, brick and tile grew into a massive enterprise, as well as like Lehigh, that then opened branches throughout the state to provide farmers with the opportunity to drain lands. If you go back to like, I don't know, when they first started tiling in Mason City in the late 1800s, they were holding like local, I was reading about a local meeting at the library where they were like, we need to do this locally so we can be able to do it. And it grows into one of the largest industries in Iowa by the turn into the 20th century. Draining, ditching, and tiling is going to be incredible in Iowa. I mean, we're talking about whether it's like the ongoing PhD research of somebody like Kristen Gredeman at Iowa State, who's working on tiling out an entire lake at the head of the Skunk River, or somebody like Joe Otto, who he wrote a great dissertation at University of Oklahoma called Plumbing the Prairies, that talks about changes on the Skunk River and how you could put a canoe into the Skunk River and go 100 miles without being in a natural foot of that river. That looks really different in North Iowa. I've got a student right now working on a project. He's from Kossuth County, but he should be from Bancroft County, which is our phantom 100th county on the map. And he's looking at that draining, ditching, and tiling, and that kind of war to claim that as agriculturally productive land. And now part of that's vested in the Union Slough National Wildlife Refuge. But a lot of the guys on my slow pitch softball team, they farm that land now because of the technological change created by draining, ditching, and tiling. Some of the efforts are going to fail, like Rice Lake State Park is one of my favorite other ones. They tried to tile that out and the lake wouldn't be defeated. So it had found its way eventually into the state park system. But this is what we're talking about. We talk about major ecological and environmental change in Iowa. A lot of the rhetoric during that time period is warfare, that we're going to battle to claim these lands, improve them, and bring them into this agricultural production system. And that's one of the things that's going to lead us towards that. I mean, to drop the water table on that scale across the state is absolutely wild to me. I don't know. It's one of the things I find super interesting, but then again, maybe I'm just more into drain tiles than other people.
And Bailey, just to chime in quickly, and
Sure.
if Christine wants to too, the other thing that draining and tiling is critical to is our transportation system with automobiles, internal combustion engines. I had transportation engineer tell me in the late 1990s, you can't have good roads in Iowa without good drainage, without keeping the water away from the roadway in those still, dirt and gravel road days before paving. So to have a good road bed requires good drainage. So it's really critical to what our road system is like in the early 20th century too.
Kevin, you mentioned Iowa's 100th county. Just going to put in a plug. We did a Curious Iowa story about that. Leo's in that story as well. So check that out at thegazette.com/curious. I want to end with this great question from the audience. How does community-supported agriculture, like farm wife eggs and farmers markets, fit into this historical conversation?
This is a personal opinion, not professional expert, but care about where your food comes from. Support those people in your communities that are small producers. This is a thing my partner and I talk about all the time. She's very passionate about food as well, but we try to think about who raises the pork we eat and the cattle we eat. And we've been able, that's one of the things we love about living in rural Iowa in particular, is we know where most of our food comes from. And that's an advantage we have in Iowa. But I think if you're in one of these rural spaces, or even if you're in Des Moines, Leo, you can care about your food system and you can procure a lot of that stuff. And I think supporting those producers a lot, like, I don't know, Steve, who I get produce from, does a great job on his farm in Mitchell County, thinking about how he's taking care of the land, how he's providing a diverse crop rotation on his landscape, and how he can be successful in his business by being a great member of the community. And I think that's incredibly important.
Leo, Christine, any thoughts on that one?
I mean, sure, there's definitely an environmental benefit. The less miles your food has to travel, the better. And like Kevin said, it just gives you a good feeling knowing exactly where it's coming from and how the farmers are using their land.
It's something any of the more rural folks paying attention this morning will know, but since the 1930s, if you're someone who eats animal protein, we have had a strong system of lockers. We have, I think, always led the nation in the number of local processors. And we saw how critical, even in some ways, that was during 2020, 2021, was that as larger suppliers and processors were trying to keep up, that people were paying attention to those local processors. So all across our state, I've been to more than 75 lockers across Iowa, from Lee County. I haven't made it up to George yet. I need to get up to Northwest Iowa. I've had product from George, but not just produce, but there's really great opportunity to support farmers of all backgrounds, or even if you don't want to buy half of a hog or a quarter of a beef, paying attention to Iowa companies, whether it be Nyman Ranch pork or some of the other local folks, Berkwood Farms, can be, again, reducing the carbon footprint of pork, but there's lots of great options out there to get local food.
For the folks who filed in during the session and missed our introduction, the Curious Iowa track is based off of a Gazette series called Curious Iowa that started in May of 2023. It's a weekly series that answers readers' questions about our state, its people, and culture. The series is driven by the questions we receive from community members like you, like people wondering who picks up roadkill on the side of the road, where the Underground Railroad stops are in Iowa, and how often Iowa's rivers are clean, just to name a few. And if you want to continue the conversation, submit your questions at thegazette.com/curious. I want to thank our panelists and the attendees for spending your morning with us. And I'm going to invite Zach Kaczarski back on to close us out.
Well, thanks, Bailey, and thank you, Leo, Kevin, and Christine, for your insights. I know I learned a lot there, just listening in the background. A couple more reminders for folks. Today at 4 o'clock, we welcome our first keynote. It's Iowa City native Harper Steele from the recently released Netflix documentary, Will and Harper. The session is live, and we aren't going to record that one, so please plan accordingly if you want to attend that one. Next, a reminder, please visit the message boards in the Whova app and the community boards. We have several panelists that are going to be posing questions and keep the conversations going outside of the sessions. And that's also the place where you can directly engage with each other and with the panelists. And finally, we know that there are a lot of sessions to select from over the next day and a half. Our plan is to, you're not going to get to view all of them, but our plan is to have the recorded sessions available by early next week at the Iowa Ideas website. With that, that concludes the opening kickoff. It's time to find the first panels, and those begin at 9:35. You have a great day, everyone.